Riding the video game boom at the dawn of the 80s, various companies entered the electronic handheld gaming market. These pocket-sized devices were naturally limited in power compared to home consoles, but this also made it an area in which creativity could really shine. Nintendo was among the companies to introduce a portable gaming line, the Game & Watch. It had its humble beginnings as a pet project of Gunpei Yokoi and Satoru Okuda, two longtime Nintendo employees working in their still modest electronics department named R&D 1. Prototyping the games involved a considerable amount of handcrafting and electronics, as these were the days before PCs became the norm. The creativity among the team led to an exploration of a wide variety of themes, all sharing the same charming graphic design that made them stand out. Both the Game & Watch and R&D 1 quickly grew to be of major importance to the company and their ventures into the gaming market. When Nintendo's arcade game Donkey Kong became a worldwide phenomenon, developing a Game & Watch adaptation was only natural. It took some skill to turn it into a satisfying experience within the limits of the LCD and 4-bit microcontroller. The developers combined their creativity on both the hardware and gameplay fronts, introducing the D-pad to navigate Mario across the playfield and adding the crane mechanic to deepen the gameplay. The pocket-sized adventure was a fun and convenient way to experience the adventures of Mario and the Kongs at home or even outside. Game & Watch was a staple that most kids got to experience in the fragmented home gaming market of the 80s. The Game & Watch series remained highly popular during the 80s. Yokoi and Okada started making their plans for a successor with interchangeable cartridges in 1987. Okada wanted it to resemble their 8-bit console in having its own unique library of A-grade games. Instead of rushing it to the market, they took the time to develop this new system, the Game Boy. Okada had worked closely with Sharp to turn his rough prototype into a manufacturable machine. The new custom-made LCD and Z80-style processor opened up a world of possibilities compared to the Game & Watch. In line with the core concept of the Game Boy, the planned Mario game would not be a rehash of his antics of yesterday. It would offer the player a brand new adventure through Mario Land. By the late 80s, Nintendo's once tiny electronics department was now stretching 4 full divisions, all making their own major contributions, whether it be in hardware or software. Their mascot, Super Mario, was the creation of R&D 4, the team of Miyamoto and Tezuka. While the Game Boy was in production, they were busy wrapping up Super Mario Bros. 3 and gearing up for Nintendo's new 16-bit machine. The task to develop a launch lineup for the Game Boy, including the new Mario game, fell upon Gunpei Yokoi's R&D 1. They would therefore be responsible for both the hardware and software for the handheld system. Out of the launch titles, Super Mario Land would best demonstrate the vision for the system, delivering home gaming sensibilities to their handheld, taking cues from their flagship releases while also adding a new unique spin. The Game Boy's core video capacities were quite similar to the 8-bit home consoles, featuring a background plane that allowed for smooth scrolling and a layer for sprites. But developing for a handheld system also came with its own distinct challenges. The games were sold at a lower price point. Cartridges were typically far more limited in their storage capacity compared to the home console market. Even with a very restricted number of unique tiles per stage, the Mario Land team were still able to create expansive side-scrolling levels with their own theme, cleverly reusing existing tiles. All the required tiles for a complete set of stages would even fit within the 2 video RAM banks of the Game Boy. The stages were brought to life by the tunes of R&D 1's veteran sound programmer and composer Hirokazu Tanaka. He composed the soundtrack while also making his contributions to the Game Boy's audio capabilities. Another challenge that came with the handheld development were the properties of the LCD. Its small size and low resolution were naturally points of consideration for the planners. The ghosting of this generation of LCD was another factor to bear in mind. The screen still partly displayed the previous frame, and therefore all moving objects were blurry. Taking this into account, the developers went for thin outlines to detail the backgrounds, greatly limiting the amount of visible ghosting. It also helped to make the tiny characters really stand out, even under less than optimal lighting conditions. R&D 1 was already a seasoned development team at that time. Along with creating the Game & Watch line, they had also produced home console hits like Kid Icarus and Metroid. Several of the staff members who were involved in these productions were working on Mario's portable adventure. They added a personal touch to the franchise through their own distinct ideas. Every kingdom has its own setting, some inspired by Earth history, like pyramids, ancient China, or Moai statues. Some of those were pretty uncommon settings in the Mario series thus far. They even mixed in 2 fun shoot-'em-up stages that pushed it even further from being a mere copy of the original Super Mario Bros. Super Mario Land had its own flavor, but when it came to the box art, they would stay true to the established look. Nintendo had its own packaging team that illustrated the manuals and boxes. Former animator Yoichi Kotabe had been a key figure in establishing this department. He perfected the designs of their icons, who from this point remained consistent in print. At launch, Super Mario Land was certainly a quality release that immediately lifted the stature of the Game Boy, establishing it to be more than a machine that played ports of games from yesterday. Despite not having the storage space or development force of the flagship home console games, with some creative spirit, it was still possible to make captivating games with a strong identity, cleverly adapted to the unique properties of the Game Boy. R&D 1 continued being the main supplier of Game Boy software within Nintendo, developing fun puzzle games like Dr. Mario, which were perfect for the handheld, but also pushing its boundaries with titles like Super Mario Land 2, a project that was stored on a much bigger ROM cartridge compared to its predecessor. Despite the storage capacity available, the artists still had to walk the fine line between detail and visibility. A trick they carried over from Super Mario Land was the usage of outlines in the backgrounds. They also chose a flat, cartoony style, relying on big patches of single-colored objects. Tricks that reduced the impact of the LCD ghosting, but still made for visually appealing backgrounds. Boss fight rooms, on the other hand, were static and could therefore be more detailed. Mario's latest release on the Super Nintendo would be a leading influence, but the team had no shortage of original ideas. Players had to navigate Mario through a wide variety of levels with more distinct theming compared to its 16-bit brother. The creative team was composed of a new recruit and 2 R&D 1 veterans who had served as graphic designers on the Game & Watch line. Free from the restrictions of the Mushroom Kingdom, they populated Mario Land with a new, colorful group of monsters, including a main bad guy. Super Mario Land 2 raised the bar for Game Boy platformers, presenting its own distinct flavor within the framework of Super Mario World. It was an excellent substitute for those who didn't have a Super Nintendo. While R&D 1 was successfully adding to Nintendo's portable game portfolio, R&D 4 was making their impact on the home front, delivering the highly anticipated 16-bit installments of Mario and Zelda in the early 90s. In a period of downtime, a more atypical project crossed their path. A Zelda game for the Game Boy, a system they weren't actually developing for. It was the freewheeling experiments of Kazuaki Morita that sparked interest within the division. Morita was a senior programmer at SRD, R&D 4's longtime partner company who programmed their game plans. Nintendo actually had close partnerships with a number of tech companies during the 80s, another being Intelligent Systems, who delivered their development kits. Morita's tinkering with the only Game Boy dev kit within the division would transition into the humble beginnings of a portable Zelda. R&D 4's Tezuka felt it was the perfect project after his directorial work on Nintendo's 2 biggest releases. This side project would provide him with the opportunity to explore a different tone, free from the restrictions and expectations that came with developing for their flagship console. Together with 2 writers who also worked on the previous Zelda, they formed a small development team. The iconic image of a giant egg on top of a mountain was established early on. It had been one of the ideas they weren't able to fit in the previous game. The writing team established it as the home of the sleeping windfish on a dreamy, remote little island, a setting that aligned with Tezuka's desire to stray from the established themes within the franchise. It also gave them the opportunity to infuse it with some Twin Peaks-styled mystery. The production was as unconventional as its story, starting out as a fun side project for the developers which they worked on after hours. Eventually, it became an official project, but the free-spirited nature remained. The team also remained fairly small, with a handful of developers doing the bulk of the work. Link's new Game Boy adventure would use a flip-screen game style akin to the original Zelda. The static backgrounds had the added benefit of not being affected by the ghosting of the LCD. All rooms could therefore be richly detailed and textured. The bulk of the in-game graphics work fell upon the shoulders of a single pixel artist, Masanao Arimoto. Luckily, the design work done for the Super Nintendo entry served as a strong foundation, providing the art style and reference for numerous graphics. Link's sprites, for instance, were retooled to the Game Boy specifications. One of the challenges were the limited color palette, going from 13 colors to 3 shades of gray. All the emphasis was put on a defining black outline. It was also necessary to reduce the sprites in height by 1 tile. They chose to keep the detail in Link's face and instead squeeze down the body. Arimoto was able to perfectly capture the detail and essence of the colorful Super Nintendo sprites with minimum data. The game was further enriched with countless new characters and objects that nicely complemented the rest of the work. Sometimes the passing of time is the main ingredient required to advance visuals. The Super Nintendo, with its graphical capabilities, had pushed the franchise towards a more sophisticated art style. The central feature of bold outlines was a style that translated very well to the small palette and screen of the Game Boy. The expanding ROM sizes over the years was another benefit. Link's Awakening was put on a 4 megabit cartridge, huge for a Game Boy game and only half of its 16-bit brother, enough to richly detail the dreamy island of Koholint, making most of its peculiar inhabitants visually distinct. The Game Boy graphics chip was pretty comparable to the NES. When it came to pushing sprites, the handheld actually had an edge. The small screen estate meant that sprites would fill up a relatively larger portion of the screen. Additionally, the system was able to display 2 more sprites per scan line. To further extend the number of on-screen sprite tiles, the game uses the 8x16 sprite mode. Most characters therefore only used 2 sprites instead of 4. This made the limit of 40 on-screen sprites still enough to display Link, monsters in all sizes, and even an additional supporting character. By this point, developers began to rely on the trick to transfer a few graphical assets' runtime into the VRAM. It was within a fraction of a second that these operations had to occur, mainly the moment in between the rendering of 2 frames. Through optimized code, the programmers were able to squeeze at least 20 sprite tiles into the VRAM per frame. It allowed them to stream Link's animation from the cartridge, and so taking up just 4 tiles in VRAM in total. The game also featured various special effects sprinkled throughout the adventure. The opening sequence showcased a parallax effect by changing the scrolling speed of the background mid-frame. The same trick was the basis for the various wavy effects. The playful spirit amongst the team had remained throughout development. It led to small details that gave the islanders their personalities, using the music, dialogue, or even their house interiors. For instance, they placed a bunch of closets in the house of the village elders, giving the impression that Grandma was likely a fashionable lady. Lead programmer Morita would even showcase his passion for fishing through a fun minigame. His fellow programmer actually appeared in the game as one of the villagers. The game's soundtrack also greatly added to the island's feel of mischief and mystery, blending the familiar leitmotif with a range of new themes. The game's underlying concept of a dream world opened up the possibility of adding characters from other Nintendo franchises. Mario's adversary, the Chomp, was turned into a feisty but helpful pet in the game. One of the Chomps was even quite fashionable. The new Zelda game would be shaped by an abundance of unique ideas, but some concepts were left on the drawing table. For instance, a two-player boss battle through the use of the link cable. By the summer of 1993, the unique Zelda experience was ready to be enjoyed by players, packed with a set of challenges and puzzles. The original title, Dreaming Island, was changed to Link's Awakening for the Western release, thereby cleverly hiding the final story reveal. Link's Awakening was a perfect example of what left-field ideas can bring to a production. Initially, there had been plans to port the Super Nintendo game to the Game Boy, but even when executed perfectly, it would still have to stand in the shadow of its bigger brother. Instead, the development team fully embraced the creative freedom that came with the Game Boy, a platform that didn't have the burden of their flagship home console, free to experiment with new concepts. These creative ideas shaped the outings of Link and Mario on the Game Boy, standing firm in their own right, next to their big brothers among the top of Nintendo's output at the time.